Okay, so goodbye useState and hello React's Miami. So first of all, let's get through this. Who am I? It honestly doesn't matter. We have a lot to talk about today. But if you really want to know, I'm David Khourshid, David K. Piano, pretty much everywhere online because I play piano. I live here in the Sunshine State. I also really enjoy TypeScript too. And I am the creator of useState. And also, I gave a talk a while ago called Goodbye UseEffect. Some of you might remember that, where basically I was talking about all of the defects of UseEffect and how it's honestly a major foot gun. And the first time I gave that talk, I actually got a lot of hate for it, like, oh, he doesn't understand UseEffect, etc. Like, UseEffect has been fine for us, like, you know, we could manage it, etc. But also a lot of people agreeing. Joke's on them because the React team actually came out with docs. You might not need an effect. Which basically validates my entire talk. So basically, I'm going to be doing the same today because we need to talk about useState. You know, I know a lot of you love useState. Whoever wrote this tweet, please see me after class. But recently, there was a React survey, and in terms of retention and usage, useStates was at the very top. I get it. You love this hook. It's the very first one you learn. The second one is probably useEffect, and then you're like, I don't need any other hooks. You know, makes sense. But like, you know, old habits die hard. I mean, take a look at this. We have Axios here. Fetch is right there. What are you doing? Okay, just use fetch. But yeah, so what is the problem with useState? You might be like, hey, it's such a simple hook, and you know, it just works. I could just put my state in there, and my components work just fine. Well, the thing is, useState and useEffect sort of have this symbiotic relationship where it's just, it gets really, really messy because useState triggers a useEffect, which might trigger another useState, which might trigger another useEffect, which triggers the same useState. And if you're not careful, this is where you go into infinite loop territory. And also, this might just affect props of another component, which is going to trigger another useEffect, which it probably has its own useState here, which triggers props. And like, basically, this is what your application logic tends to look like when you decide to put everything inside of useState and useEffect. It becomes very hard to maintain. So we're not talking about 0 to 1, where, oh yeah, we just need app logic, we need, you know, to put state in components. It's really easy to do with useState. I'm talking about when you're adding so many features to your application that you have trouble understanding what is happening where and what is causing the states to change. And also, why is useEffect rerunning so many times? But you might also be thinking, hey, Windsurf generated this useState, useEffect code, or whatever else you're using, you know, Copilot, Cursor, etc. And so you might think it's fine, right? It's because AI, it's smarter than us. But I need you to understand something, and this is pretty much going to be the only AI thing I, you know, post today. LLMs weren't trained on good code. They were trained on your code, okay? So I'm not saying your code is bad or good, but anyway, all right, so let's jump into useState. So first of all, controlling renders. Something you need to know, and something hopefully everyone knows, is that with useState, when you change state, even if you need it in only one part of your component, or maybe another inner component, etc., you are basically causing a re-render for the entire component tree that it's under. And so for a lot of applications, sure, this might be fine, but eventually once you get to performance issues, you could usually trace it to a useState that's just causing way too many re-renders. And without significant refactors, it's sort of hard to handle that. One simple strategy that you could do, though, is if you have states that has nothing to do with the UI or the rendering, just put it in a ref. That's what it's for. It's like React's secret useStates where you really don't want React to know about what's going on, so you just hide it in a useRef. So in this case, we're handling, like, it's a trivial example. We are tracking the number of clicks, but we could just do that in a ref instead of having to use state. So as a rule of thumb, use ref for internal state that's not related to rendering. Another thing that we could do is use the URL state. And this is an extremely powerful pattern that I don't think many of us are taking advantage of. So let's say that you have a component where you're sorting, you have ascending, descending, etc. You might have all of these filters. The problem is that once you refresh the page, the user is going to get really mad because all of their filters are instantly gone. And I get anxiety whenever I go to a page which has all these complex UIs and is definitely built in React, because I know once I refresh, everything I set there is going to be gone. There's no URL that I could point to. So that's why it's really, really useful to consider using state on your actual URL using search parameters. And actually, both Next and Remix do encourage this. You could tell it's Next by the giant triangle over here. I made it pink, which is against their design guidelines, but I think it looks better that way. With Next, it's actually sort of obtuse. You have to do a bunch of things. You have to create a query string, and you have to sort of push that, the path name with the constructed query string to the router. But it's possible to do, and Next.js does give you the tools for this. If you're part of Vercel, cover your eyes because it's a lot easier in Remix. Regardless of whether you're using Remix or Next.js, there's also a very awesome library called Nux, however you pronounce that. I forget what it stands for, something. And essentially, you are replacing useState with useQueryState. And I've tested this. It works really nicely. So it's just almost a one-to-one swap, where basically whatever state you have in your component, it reflects in the URL. And then all of a sudden, you have a URL where it captures the state for you. So in short, I want you to consider if state is something that you want to persist, or you want people to keep in the URL and then refresh the page and have everything exactly where they put it, consider putting state in the URL. There's a lot of libraries and frameworks help you to make it really, really easy to do. And I do also want to shout out ShadCNUI and Nux. These two libraries have a couple things in common. They're great libraries and they have really weird names. But all good libraries have weird names. All right, now, if you were at Chance's talk yesterday, I had to implement fetching data. And every single time that we fetch data, this is essentially muscle memory for experienced React developers. We have a bunch of use states where we have set as loading, error, and some other stuff. In fact, I forgot some things here. I forgot to add the is canceled, or now it's like you could use the abort controller and then have an abort signal and just pass that in. I can't say that word too much in Florida, by the way. It's illegal. So anyway, if you search your code base, you see you will pretty much find like set loading everywhere. We're doing this pattern all over the place. Just look in your code base. I guarantee you will find that. What's the solution? Adam talked about it, or at least I think he did. The slides were backwards there, so I couldn't really see, but I'm assuming he talked about RSCs, where you could essentially just get rid of all of that, embrace RSCs, and which stands for React Server Components, and just do away with all of that, those variables. So essentially, all you have to do is await, grab the product, and then just render it on the page as a server component. But let's say, or actually, there's another really cool hook, which is use transition. And this actually takes care of setting that is pending or is loading, whatever you want to call it. It sets that variable for you, so you could actually just make your await call in there and then have that variable without having to do all of that Boolean juggling. So this is a very cool React 19 hook that you could use. But of course, if you're like, oh, I actually want to do client-side state management with fetching data, et cetera, just use something like, well, I guess now it's called TanStack query. Use something like that, because I know I'll get a lot of hate for this too, but it will handle fetching data better than you, okay? It does the whole, it even goes beyond useEffect. It's using usync external store under the hood, but it handles so much more, like every use case you could think of and more. Now, forms. This is another place where useState comes up very, very often, and you might be thinking like this is also React 101. Obviously, if you have a form, you will have a useStates for each field in your form, and you could just, for example, have a first name, set the first name, and then put that in your inputs. You're like, things can't get simpler than this. You bring it into handle submit, and then you could do whatever you want with the form data. But here's the thing. Ever since, I don't know, the beginning of the internet, these form inputs and these form fields and the form itself, they're actually storing that state for you in the component. So you're essentially sort of duplicating efforts. So essentially we have, let's get rid of that useState. We just have a name on there, first name. And then we could handle that form data in handle submit. We have this form data API. Again, it's been around for a long time. And if you really want to be type safe, then use something like SOD, parse that data. This is something that you should be doing anyway. And it does give you validation superpowers too. Now, Remix does encourage you to do this too. It has, form actions, capital form, and you could just handle that data right in the Remix loader, or Remix, whatever they're called, actions. I don't use Remix, but I should. Or you could use Vercel, and Vercel also encourages this pattern with server actions. So I really recommend you use server actions because I think you saw in previous talks that it makes it very easy to just capture that form data and basically use it. You could do anything async with it. But of course, you might be thinking, I have complex form needs. I have validation and masking, and I want to debounce, and I have all of these things that this simple form stuff is not going to handle. Use a library. There's Tanstack form, there's React hook form, there's final form, there's other libraries like that. They will handle complex forms better than you. Again, they're going to handle the edge cases that you haven't really thought of. All right, now let's talk about overusing state because I see these patterns a lot. You might think useState is simple, and then you end up using 8, and then just things blow out of control. I call this vibe state management. So what can we do here? There's many reasons why this state explosion can happen, but what we could do is, first of all, it's a habit to just have granular use states, just group related data. It doesn't make things that much more complex. Now we have everything in a big object instead. We could have a function for handling the change, or we could use something like immer if you don't want to do all that dot spreading or destructuring, constructuring, whatever it's called. You could just use immer, and it becomes one line. You're not really mutating here, but with immer, it allows you to update nested data really easily using mutation-like patterns. Another one, which is near and dear to my heart, is when you're doing step-by-step forms. You might have all of these Boolean variables, and then in order to just change the step, you're basically like a switchboard operator. You're setting some to true, some to false, essentially getting the right Boolean to have the right value. And honestly, that's where string enums come in. It enforces that you can only have one of these values at a time, which is extremely useful. And if you do this, you are one step closer to making an actual state machine, which I'm not going to talk about at this talk. Save that for another talk. But going further than that, discriminated unions. This is also something that I showed at Chance's talk yesterday. We have a lot of use states here, and also some of these are Booleans, and you can't really guarantee that some of them are going to be true while the others are false. Like, you don't have that exclusivity. So what you could do instead, the first step, is using a string enum, where you could say it can only be one of those values, either idle, loading, success, or error. And that solves part of the problem. But unfortunately, we still have no type-safe guarantees that we have a data when it's success, or we have an error message when it's an error. So that's where we could actually use what's called a discriminated union. And so a discriminated union allows us, using this discriminant value, the status, to say when it's success, we definitely have data. When it's error, we definitely have this error string. And then we could just use that, and the lines of code are exactly the same. It doesn't really add much more complexity to your code, and it makes it more type safe and robust. All right, so another one, derived state. So this is something that I see a lot, and I guarantee it's in your code base. We might have some state, like let's say we're opening up a donut shop, and we might have derived states where we are calculating things like total items, subtotal, etc., using useState. So what does this mean? It means that we have to recalculate those in a use effect every single time. And this is a huge anti-pattern because essentially you could just calculate these things directly in render. And I know some of you might be like, yeah, I already know this, but I'm going to use memo to be safe. Honestly, don't even bother with that unless you know it's going to be a significant performance impact. But essentially, you could just do derived states directly in render. All right, so now let's talk about, getting further, reducing state or reducing logic for that matter. I know what you're thinking, not this, I know what you're thinking. You know, okay, I hate useState at this point, and I'm coming to you, showing you something awesome. I know. So, this hook exists for a reason, and the reason is managing complex logic. So let's say we still have that same donut store. We have complex logic for adding a donut, removing a donut. We might want to check the inventory, etc. These are things where we don't necessarily want to rely on useState because useState implies you could update the data directly when it shouldn't be the case in here. You want to check the inventory. So I'm sorry for making you actual software engineers, but like we are going to do a little bit engineering here, handle each of the actions, or I like to call them events, in a simple function. And the beauty about this is that it's still the same over here. We're adding a donut, removing a donut, except we're dispatching events instead of manipulating state directly. And you could also directly test this. So as much hate as useReducer gets, and I understand that it is somewhat complicated to use, it does make things a lot nicer when you reach that threshold of my application logic is too complex for simple useState. And also it embraces an indirect pattern of updating states. And this is something I could talk about for hours, but essentially when you use events instead of directly updating state, you get a whole bunch of information. You get basically the cause of the change, any parameters related to the change, when the change happened, and essentially a log of traceability so you could actually see what are all of the events that basically led up to this state instead of the state just being updated from who knows where. All right, so moving on, syncing with external stores. There's this really cool hook called useSyncExternalStore where essentially you give it three arguments: subscribe, get snapshot, and get the server snapshot. And you would be forgiven if you haven't heard of this hook or used it because it is hidden in those other hooks like useDebugValue and useID, etc. But this is a pattern that I see a lot too. We have a useState here for calculating something like the window width and useEffect for subscribing to, hint, an external store or an external source of truth, which is the browser API for listening to when the window resizes. Instead of having that useState and useEffect thing, I'm spilling my water. Apologies for whoever stands here next. But instead, you could just put everything in a simple subscribe function and then pass that to useSyncExternalStore, and then you have this function that gets the snapshot, and things become a lot simpler. Now, one of the first times where I ran into an actual need for useSyncExternalStore was when I was trying to do the simplest thing, which is show a date. How hard could this be? It's a client component, so surely this will only run on the client. Not exactly. So next, we'll yell at you for some reason because the server doesn't match the clients, but we're like, please, I just want the client. So sure, you could use useEffect and useState, but there's another very useful pattern, which is useSyncExternalStore, and that allows you to provide both a client snapshot and a server snapshot. Unfortunately, this won't work either. Next provides some very beautiful errors showing you that, sorry, you can't actually do this. So we do have to convert it to a string so it is serializable and it doesn't yell at us for not caching the value or something like that. There's a really good blog post on this if you want to learn more. useSyncExternalStore is great for when you need something to show or something to reconcile between the server and the client for state. Now, of course, React is going to tell you like, hey, useSyncExternalStore is mostly for non-React code and third-party libraries, etc. I'm of this opinion, though, but Anyway, third-party libraries. So this, of course, is a hot topic where we might think, okay, why would I need a third-party library? And why would I need like global states, etc.? Because most of the time I could just get by with useStates, useReducer, whatever. So the situation happens more often than not that you want state, useState. The state has special logic, like useReducer. I want to share it between my components, so use context. Right now it's causing too many re-renders, so I need to use some sort of pub/sub pattern. I hear my Floridians. I don't need the entire state, so you have a useSelector hook, and at that point, you essentially just reinvented Redux. And if you want to know how, just talk to Mark Erickson. He's in the crowd somewhere. But these external stores essentially work either by directly having this global store or having the store provided through React context. There's a lot of options to choose from, but since I'm on the stage, I'm going to be talking to you about not xStates, but xState store, which is a related library from xState. So the syntax for this is pretty simple, actually, and it's meant to be simple because it's only like 2 kilobytes, less than 2 kilobytes. You create a store where you provide the context and transitions for how the data changes, and then you could subscribe to those data changes and trigger events to send. We have this new dot syntax instead of dot send, so it makes it a lot easier to autocomplete. But you could just pass this into a component using the useStore hook, and then you could have all of your logic basically inside here. All of the types are inferred for you. So you also have selectors so that you could control how often it re-renders. And then you just trigger changes by calling trigger with whatever transition actions or events that you defined. So hopefully you hate this less than useReducer because we tried to make all the types inferred for you and make it a nice global or local store experience. And also, you can emit. So essentially, you have declarative effects over here where you could now use effect for its intended purpose, listen to any events that you've emitted, and react to them with whatever effects that you want. It handles both doing things in a global store and a local store too. It's crazy, right? So you could essentially replace useReducer with this. And we also recently introduced atoms. So you could essentially have, I'm using the word essentially a lot. It's a great word. You can change that value and create combined atoms and things like that. And yeah, so please check out xState store. And the last thing I really want to talk about quickly is local first state, or as we heard earlier, this is a sync engine. And sync engines are really awesome because instead of doing the round trip of fetching data, you essentially just sync data with your database, and things just happen automatically. Go look at the talk from earlier today on this. It's really, really great. There's a lot of libraries that do this for you. So basically, if you want to just have your database and your front end react and sync with each other, there's a lot of magical libraries for doing that, and it's a great way to have offline local first state. So just let that sink in. All right, so in conclusion, useStates, you should use it for a truly component internal local state and realize that not all state is UI state. And continue to ask yourself, is there a better pattern? React 19 introduces so many better patterns. So overall, start with useState, refactor to better patterns, and focus on long-term maintenance. Simple is better than easy. Thank you so much, React Miami.